The third use of the law. Now, within the Reformation traditions, both in the Reformed and in the Lutheran camp, there were discussions about the nature of God's law, especially because the distinction between law and gospel was so central to the Reformation, where there were discussions of what is the function of the law. The law does not save for the Protestant, so what does the law do? This was a big question that was being asked by Martin Luther, John Calvin, Philip Melanchthon, and many others. And essentially, where both of those traditions ended up is defining the law as basically having a threefold purpose. There are three main functions or purposes of God's law as he gave it to us. And so they would say that the three functions are these. One, there is a civil use or a civil function of God's law. And in this civil function, the law guides society. It is something that is used externally, even if someone does not have faith. The law is still used as a kind of external guide for even the unbeliever. St. Paul speaks about this in, say, Romans chapter 2, which talks about the law that is written on the heart. So there is some kind of moral sense that is written on humanity as a whole. This is sometimes called the law as a curb. It kind of keeps one in a certain path, regardless of the state of one's faith. Now, second, the law has the second object of the law, or role or function of the law, is that it convicts one of their sins and then leads them to Christ. And so this is, for the Lutheran tradition, this was always described to be the primary function of the law. Now, the Calvinists generally say this change the order. This is the first function, the civil is the second function. But however we want to number these things, those two realities are both there. Sometimes the scholastics would actually divide this into two parts. One is that the law convicts. The other is that now as the law has convicted, it leads one to the gospel or leads one to Christ. Generally, though, it's seen as two parts of the same function or use of the law. This is the central one for Lutherans. It's the secondary one generally for the Reformed tradition. And so the third here, function of the law, which is known as the third use of the law, in both traditions we number them the same. The third use of the law is a guide for the Christian. And this is now a unique function of the law that is for the one who has faith. This is for the regenerate believer. This is not the function of the law that is for the unbeliever, but specifically for the regenerate believer. And in this function of the law, the Christian is guided in good works by the law. And so this is the law as something that is good and positive. And this is something that was discussed often in conversations with Rome, where the reformers were accused of having a negative view of God's law because of the emphasis on the condemnatory use, or the second function of the law, as at least the Lutherans would number it. And in response to that, both sides of the Reformation said, no, we have a third function of the law, which is a positive use of the law. It is not efficacious for justification, but it is a rule or a standard which guides the Christian in faith and tells the Christian how they are to live in service to God and the neighbor in this world. And that is what is known then as the third use or the third function of the law. Now, in the Reformed tradition, this has generally always been accepted. John Calvin views this as the more central view of the law. The more central function of the law then is the second or more condemnatory use of the law, whereas the Lutheran tradition has seen the condemnatory use as primary, and then in this third use as coming underneath that. Still a very important function of the law, but not the most significant and most emphasized. Now, within the 20th century, there was a lot of debate about this topic of the third use of the law. Werner Ehlert, the popular Lutheran theologian, living in the beginning to mid-20th century, argued that this was essentially a Reformed idea, this third function of the law, that it didn't come from Luther, it came from Calvin, Melanchthon, and other Lutherans imported it into Lutheranism, and then it actually challenged Martin Luther's own views. He was followed by figures such as Gerhard Forde, Stephen Paulson, and others who continue to deny a third function of the law or a third use of the law, to say that either it is subsumed into the first use, there's no distinction between the first and third, or that it's just altogether unnecessary. But the Lutheran confessions themselves do confess a third use of the law. So those who are considered confessional Lutherans, who hold themselves to the traditional views of the Book of Concord is still true today, hold to a third use of the law. And the thesis that Martin Luther himself did not hold to a third use of the law has also been challenged by Edward Engelbrecht and some others who have argued that Luther does indeed hold a third use of the law. Whether or not that terminology actually comes from Luther or not is not really that relevant to the question. So that is the third use of the law in summary. Thanks so much for watching. This is a Theology Video Encyclopedia where we take these theological ideas, break them down to really short clips, and give you an exposition of where different traditions are coming from, where debate on these issues is today. So if you want to see more of these, please like and subscribe. We'll see you next time. God bless.